Good afternoon. I think we're live. Welcome to what I believe is the fifth in this series of Gender on the Agenda, organized by Landor and sponsored by Mott, MacDonald and the Urban Transport Group. The previous four webinars were recorded, and this webinar will also be recorded and are accessible via YouTube. So if you just search for Gender on the Agenda on YouTube, you will find the previous four recordings there. As the slide says, I'm Tom van Vuren. I'm the Regional Director in feature-listed consulting for the UK and Europe. We're an originally Australian firm, and we started operating here in the UK in February last year. Now, I'm a chartered transport planning professional. I'm really proud to be a CTPP, but I mainly identify as a transport modeler, and that's why I think this session is really important. I'm really pleased to chair this. Transport modeling, more even than transport planning in general, is tending to be experienced as male and white dominated. And I don't really have the statistics for this, but my experience in organizing the Modeling World Conference every year is that it's much easier to find white male speakers than it is to find women or to represent modeling in the conference. And that's a problem because modeling and data analytics underpin, and certainly in my mind should underpin, transport planning policy, design, project decisions. And it's important that our data, models and analysis reflect the whole of the population and their different needs. The models that we use for forecasting are calibrated to the data that we collect today. And if you want to, you can see perceive model outputs as the synthetic data that we use to get an insight into what the future might look like with or without interventions. So we start with biased data and we end up with biased models and we end up with biased forecasts. So one question for me for today is whether gender bias in data and modeling should be tackled by the mainly male existing modelers in the field, or whether we should get women to have a greater input and impact to increase the voice of underrepresented groups in the redesign of the way in which we collect data, design models, use models, and model outputs. And that's why I was really pleased that the three women that I asked to speak today accepted the invitation. I know they're all three very passionate advocates for tackling gender issues in transport, seeking a greater gender balance, and they all have done very interesting and relevant work in the area, which I hope today they can share with us. So I will introduce them in a second, but I want to quickly explain how today's webinar will hopefully pan out. Each of the panelists will speak for about 5 minutes on the topic, which, to remind you, is gender bias. Hang on, I'm looking at another screen here. Gender bias in decision making, data collection and analysis. And this is very much a warm-up for the discussion that we will have afterwards on the actual topic. The discussion will be about 25 to 30 minutes, and after that we'll open the floor to the audience. Please post your questions to the panel in the chat and like the questions that you would like to see addressed most. I will try and pick those up later in the third part of a session, which should last about 75 minutes. And I'm sure that you will use the chat to discuss amongst yourselves as well. And just as a reminder, I said it before, the session is recorded. Our speakers today, all three of them, Alexa Delbosc, she will kick off. She's a senior lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne. And her academic work draws from her research-based Masters in Social Psychology from Harvard University. She's studied the changing travel habits of young people, transport and psychological well-being, travel behavior, and human factors in public transport. It's now about 9 o'clock in the evening in Australia, so I'm very grateful, Alexa, for taking time out to talk to us. Ines, sorry, I'm just going to continue, guys, before you hand over to Alexa. Ines Kawgan is the managing director of the AEM Institute in Berlin, and the AEM Institute has the aim of creating accessible and equitable mobility through consulting, training, and research. Ines is also an accomplished academic with lecturing and research positions at a number of German universities. And the third panelist is Sharon Francis, who's a principal transport planner at Jacobs. And she specializes in transport strategy, policy creation, and business case development and assurance. Alongside her project delivery, Sherin is also a thought leader working with other industry reps to further inclusive transport research and the application of inclusion in transport appraisal processes. So now we're going to hand over to the panelists. And as I said, 5 minutes each. Alexa, have you got control?
It's actually starting with Ines. They've changed up the order on you, Tom.
Oh, that's good. We are flexible.
So I'm taking over control. Okay. Yes. Thank you for the invitation and for having me here today. That is you. That is your slide. That is us again. Okay, that's me. As I said, or as Tom said, I'm Ines Kawgan-Kagan, Managing Director of the AM Institute, but also I am a research associate at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. So I just bring 3 key messages. First, who am I? This is like just stating my background and what I've done in research of gender and mobility. And what is the relevance of the topic regarding mobility, gender, and what impacts are there, what things need to be considered. And then I'm going to give some information on how we can collect gender-sensitive data in mobility and transport, because this is still an issue. And I'm not going to give examples because I'm currently working on a guideline, which is actually going through the research process, and I'm going to give you that soon. Okay, so who am I? I'm a postdoc mobility researcher, and I focus on gender and diversity in urban areas as well. Sometimes rural areas, but mostly urban stuff, because there is the innovative mobility just happening as car sharing or micro mobility offers, or even mobility as a service in general. And I wrote my PhD about the topic why there are so many more men using car sharing with electric vehicles. And I found four to be specific social constructs that are responsible for several obstacles that women have when they would like to use those services. I'm also the managing director and founder of the AM Institute, which actually focuses on those issues in mobility and transport, because there are many projects on the side who have a look at it, but they are scientifically put in a niche. And in practice, in the last couple of years, it just got a lot of momentum to cover the topic of gender and mobility. And this is awesome that it finally gets to be recognized that we have an issue in reality. So then as well, I do lecture, I teach people how to do this, not only gender and mobility, but also empirical data collection, what to do with that. And so the general user is in the focus of the whole thing, with looking at acceptability and acceptance of specific measures, actions, and whatsoever. Okay, so why is this relevant? We know, I'm just like going briefly over this because I saw on the other slides there is some information about that as well. I'm going to just give you those bullet points here. We know that women travel differently. They have more complex trip chains, combining different tasks, and we know that the average lengths of the trips are shorter and they're closer to their home. And we know that women have different favorite and most frequently used transport means due to several reasons, like driver's license access or car availability in households. We know that there's a difference in the access to resources when it comes to financial parts, but also in decision making. When we say that we have not enough women in decision making positions, I consider this as a missing access to the resource of power of decision making. So then we have differences in the experience with transport. We have differences in the perception of items, of mobility related topics. Cars are very, very male connotated thing in our societies. For instance, safety and security are more important for women. On the other hand, so we see a lot of things that are different for men and women. And another thing that I would like to just point out briefly is that it's not only that women show different mobility patterns, travel patterns whatsoever when they are mothers, but also it starts with even young girls being differently socialized, like don't go out at night alone, things like that. Oh, I'd rather drive you, and the boys are encouraged to go by bike, things like that. But also that women take over more household responsibilities, even without children in the household, and they take more care of family members who are in need of care, for instance. So there is a huge part where gender influences our daily life and therefore our mobility. And in order to being able to see that in our data, I'm just, as I said, currently working on those guidelines on how to collect it, because many people said, oh, we need just more women in the field, but more women doesn't mean we can change a very established system in data collection. So I'm going this by having a look at the whole research process of how to get data. And this always starts with the research objective and the questions, the framework, the team composition, things like that. And then it goes to what theory, what are the hypotheses, what method am I using? Because we know that women tend to have more qualitative research, and men more often have quantitative data collection methods. So something very interesting, we know that in the surveys, for instance, the questions are phrased in a way that they are not reflecting the reality of women. And then it goes on with data preparation and analysis, meaning we lose a lot of information when we go for household aggregated data, for instance, or what we do with the data. And we're going to talk about that in the discussion then, what we do, what is the effect of gender in line with other variables that are in parallel. And of course, the interpretation, if there are just men interpreting it from their perspective and from the perspective that they know, then we just run in circles. Okay. So this is just in a nutshell where we think that we have to have gender-sensitive mobility data collection, and it's not only about having enough women in a sample, it's not about only having enough women in the team. There is much more behind that, and as I said, I'm currently working on those guidance. Thank you.
Thanks, Ines. Am I right that we now hand over to Alexa?
I believe so.
Great.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that introduction earlier, Tom. Yes, it's past 9 o'clock here, so the kids are tucked away safely in bed, and hopefully the only interruption might be the cats, but I have tried to lock them out of the room. My brief introduction is going to pose more questions than answers, I think, but I hope that it inspires some further discussion as we get into the Q&A session. My background myself, I am a researcher in travel behavior at Monash University. I do look at gender, but I look more broadly at the diversity of travel needs and attitudes towards travel barriers, as well as a little bit of research in social psychology on egocentric biases. So, for example, I've done research on transport and social exclusion. At the moment, I'm doing some research on the increase of working from home due to COVID and the impacts that has on families with school-aged children. I collaborate with amazing PhD students who've done PhDs on things like the travel needs of parents of young children, with the travel behavior of recent immigrants to Australia. And then again, from the social psychology side of things, I already saw a question in the chat about how one's personal gender and experience, I believe it very much can color our thinking and understanding of the transport system. It is a human thing. Everybody does it. We draw from our own experience first. And having conversations like this, I believe, are very important to highlight how the experience of others in the transport system can be very different to our own. I'm going to touch on some of the things that Ines touched on as well, but put a couple numbers behind it. My experiences from the Australian context. So the statistics here you'll see are in Australia. We know that women travel differently. They're less likely, one of the main things that drives this is that women in general, on average, are less likely to work full-time than men. A statistic that actually shocked me when I went and looked it up from the Australian census is adult women aged 15 and over in Australia, only 26% of them are working full-time. Only 26% of adult women are working full-time. That's a lot higher among men. Women are more likely to work part-time or not be in the labor force. 2/3 of primary caregivers are women, and that's caregiving of their own children, other people's children, or their parents. And women who do work, we know that they are less likely to commute into the city center than other destinations compared to men. Their commutes tend to be shorter than men's. They're less likely to drive to work. And in general, as Ines said, their travel tends to be more complex. Even if they are driving to work, they're probably dropping off the kids on the way and getting groceries on the way back. And all of these things that make it, on average, different to men's travel make it harder to model and predict the travel of women than men. Men have simpler travel patterns that are easier to predict. I found my controls. But these things aren't just about gender. They intersect with incredibly important other characteristics of our lives, like our ethnicity or country of birth, depending on how you measure it and what country you're in, but depending on your age, depending on your ability or physical disabilities. Just as some statistics again from Australia, 34% of single women over the age of 60 in Australia are living in poverty. They have less financial savings to draw from, and yet they live longer than their male counterparts. And norms and expectations around these things like work and family responsibilities and travel can vary a lot in different cultures. This is a graph from one of my PhD students who we don't tend to look at ethnic background in Australia other than Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander versus not. I came from America myself, so we've started to look at this and say, do people from different backgrounds travel differently? And he certainly found, yes, in his PhD, these differences in what mode people travel to work are much bigger for people who immigrated from South Asia than people who were born in Australia. And all these things interact to make things a lot more complex than we might think. But the takeaway for today that I want to say is that if you are modeling and doing BCRs to invest in reducing travel time to work, especially by car and especially into the city center, then you are investing in men more than in women. And the part of today of my opening comments that I want to flip the script is to really be thinking about what are the benefits and ways that we can invest in the way that women travel. Just to throw out some examples, and some of these are documented in literature and some of them have not really been looked at. What is the value to women and to society of getting some of these things right? What is the value to society if more women feel safe traveling by public transport at night, and not just, so they can go out and have a fun night with the girls, so they can access the nighttime economy, so they can get jobs and get home safely? What are the economic benefits there? What are the economic benefits if more children can walk themselves to school so that their parent, generally mother, can spend less time ferrying them to and from school and more time in other parts of their life? What are the benefits to society if older women and older adults can continue to walk and cycle later in life? That has benefits for their health and their economic participation. Some of these benefits have already been documented. Are we paying attention to them? Are we getting them right? Because data is not neutral. it responds to the questions we ask. Are we asking the right questions? Are we getting diverse voices asking these questions? Are we collecting the data we need to answer those questions? And are we actually going to use that data to improve the lives of women and girls and all of society? That's it from me. I'd love to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. Really thought-provoking, and I'm sure there's going to be questions generated by that. And please use the chat to do so. Sherin, I hope you've got control.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thank you, my fellow panelists, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Francis, and I've been undertaking research on gender and transport, as well as integrating it into my work as a transport planner over the past 3 years. So I did my master's from the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds, and I'm currently undertaking a joint research project with Anna Pliskova at the Transport Studies Unit at Oxford. I'd like to just quickly thank my colleague Angela Lopez Garces for her thoughts and inputs to this presentation as well. So I think one of the key things we picked up already was, from my colleagues' presentations was we know that there is a difference in the way women travel, most likely the type of modes and the difference in the statistics around travel patterns. So the good thing is we're in an age of opportunity. So we can start looking at what data sets are out there. There's more real-time information, and I'm pleased to see, as you can see on screen, some new data sets being considered by the government in the UK. So for instance, looking at perception data, because this is something that we've been promoting for the past couple of years. But interestingly, these data give you a lot of insights into why people perhaps travel the way they do. And, picking up the points what Alexa and Ines have mentioned, it maybe starts giving us some answers as to why people travel the way they do and what perhaps are the barriers to them traveling to the way we expect them to travel. So just quickly looking at this graph here, we can see that, a higher proportion of women reported feeling fairly unsafe while walking alone compared to men. And also there is a big difference when you look at during alone after dark or during the day. And interestingly, there is a statistics behind this as well, which shows that we're, looking at sex and age together, women aged 16 to 34 years old and those over 75 do feel less safe compared to females in other age groups. So it is key to look at these different intersecting characteristics, which means that you can't really get a typical type of travel for a typical person. So some of these things are key because we're looking at more and more data being collected in the UK by the National Travel Survey, by local authorities, and it's key to make sure that we're starting to ask these extra questions beyond just considering data sets that are really basic. So quickly moving on to the next slide. This is something that I pulled out, which I found really interesting from the British Medical Journal. So this is in the medical industry, and it just interestingly shows you the impact of data, the biases in data, and discrimination in looking at biased data, and the impacts of this in future technology when we start getting AI to recognize patterns and start looking at what happens in the future. So whilst this might show a clear impact on the medical side of things, you can imagine the same happening in the transport side of things. So one of the key things we need to start understanding is what are we not collecting enough to understand the factors that drive these different travel patterns and also the digital divide. So if you're starting to look at with the pandemic in focus, there's been a lot of digital influence, a lot of data collection, but there is a digital divide, and how is that going to affect the quality of the data that we're collecting? And then finally, just a very important point around AI, because once we start training AI, they are being trained on recognized patterns, and these recognized patterns are most likely to be male behavioral patterns. So are we biasing the AI of the future? So some of the impacts of unrepresentative decision making, they're huge, they're profound. And, for example, cycle lanes that are being developed, but still having a lot more male users. For example, congestion charging that are being disproportionately impacting shorter frequency trips. Season tickets, which I know they've been recently changed, but how are they really impacting part-time workers? And then parking policies, especially for those who are doing drop-offs and impacting with school runs. And then the biggest impact of all is around bus frequency, increase in bus fares, and how these affect, let's say, women more likely than male patterns. So quickly looking at transport planning. So transport planning, at the end of the day, we're building models to replicate a simulation of as much as we can of reality. But the importance of transport models, perhaps in the UK, and we'll come on to this later, is that they are ultimately being used to make decisions about investment. And investment in transport is an impact which will affect women because of the gender data gap. And this, in fact, have an impact on income inequality and, more nationally important things such as productivity and wider economy. So for instance, looking at the economic value of unpaid caregiving provided by women in the UK, that alone is estimated to be £77 billion per year. But are we considering this in the data sets or in transport modelling in general? I don't really think so. So quickly picking up some of the biases on where this comes within the transport modelling. It comes in through every stage of the process of developing a scheme. So particularly looking at the demand, it's key to understand how different groups of people behave, and this may be depending on their income, on their skill level, on their employment, and how transport models are able to accurately reflect these to see how far they go, what are the impacts, what mode do they use, and for what purpose. So if we don't really know who uses it and why, how can we start understanding schemes as to who will potentially use the scheme that we're trying to test within the model? So I think the key thing I was discussing with my colleague recently is knowing your customer base, because if you don't really know who is likely to use your scheme, how can you start planning these schemes and pulling them out? So any company would know that you need to know your customer base. You would do a research into it and take advantage of knowing who your customers would be and cater to them. So similarly, it would be key to understand all the combined variables on travel behavior and understanding that an exact permutation may not be the key. Different people are different, their circumstances are different. So making sure that we take into evidence all of the gender disparities across the spectrum and understand this when building transport models are key. Then quickly going through our next point about some of the, we can discuss this later during the session, but I've just pointed out a few key things around values of time, route choice, types of trips, incorporating trip chaining, shorter walking trips, and time period considerations. All of these have shown to have a different gendered impact. So, quickly looking at values of time, elasticities of waiting at bus stops, interchange times, these all have a bigger impact on women. Route choice, we always go for the traditional algorithms of going for the shortest minimum cost routes. But is this really true when we look at different behaviors? Types of trips. I've picked this up before, but also just to point out that Alex's point about commuting business trips into city centres and how we clump up a lot of the other trips that most often women make into others, which could mean anything, but are more crucially caregiving trips or trips that are not traditionally considered to be high value. And then incorporating trip chain and also, interestingly, on time period, are we still going to go for the typical weekday despite the pandemic? Shouldn't we move a bit more towards looking at part-time workers, how people might look like? Saturday trips are a lot higher now compared to pre-pandemic. So quite a few questions there. And finally, just to close off my presentation around some of the ways we can start thinking about making more inclusive transport models and data collection, of course, pre and post scheme implementation, and then would really like to emphasize around household data and how it's always been aggregated, because mostly in households, we have evidence showing that women in those households are at a different income level or at a different accessibility impact. So why are we still aggregating household data by the genders? Secondly, picking up quickly around things such as regulation, guidance, and political will. I can't emphasize how important this is. Picking up examples in Sweden where gender mainstreaming have been included, maybe having a repository of key examples, evidence-based, where this can be built on, and understanding how we can look at forward trip patterns, especially because there's recent research which say that women's attitudes towards the environment are significantly different to that exhibited by men and the type of modes they use. So can we start including this within our mode choice? And finally, making sure that we have pilot programs so that we can build on examples that will show us what could happen if you do take these risks going forward. So these are just some final examples I have on screen, and we can pick them up later. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Hopefully we can come back to those project examples. One of the things that I really would like to get out of today's session is also not just asking the questions, but also seeing and maybe even hearing from the audience where things are done better and where people can learn. And that was really so fantastic to have 3 speakers from 3 different countries where we can hopefully pick up some good ideas from where things are done a bit better than what we experience at the moment here in the UK. So that takes me to you, Alexa, in terms of the data collection. I want to go through data collection as it were first. Is what do you think are the key obstacles to collecting unbiased data? And particularly you being connected well across the world. Are there examples elsewhere where this is done better than what we've been doing until now?
I think the key barrier is having a will and care to do so, to recognize that this is an issue that is worth talking about and looking at and interrogating. I still attend talks where people. There was a talk recently on the increase in working from home during COVID. A speaker from Australia, an economic modeler, showing all their modeling results about changes to working from home. And somebody asked, "Well, did you look at gender?" And he said, "Oh, no, gender wasn't important in this," which raised some eyebrows. And a colleague of mine and I have done some follow-up work on some qualitative research with, as I mentioned, families of young children who can work from home and what that means for them. And okay, maybe when you do a big model across an entire population, maybe there aren't significant differences between how often men and women work from home. But when we actually talked to these families, the meaning of being able to work from home for women who are primary caregivers of their children, and the men who are primary caregivers had the primary responsibility for their children, the freedom to work from home unlocked so much of their time and stress and control over their day. Whereas the parent, where they already kind of didn't have to look after the kids as much, it was, more time to see the kids, which was nice, and less time to commute, which was nice. But the meaning of that was so very different. And if we're not asking those questions, if we don't think they're important, we're never going to get that data in the first place.
Yeah, I think a real important point that came out there is, I think, constraints, and that may be something we need to think about a little bit more. Ines, from your perspective, is there something we can learn from the German experience?
Yeah, from the German experience, I mean, the discussion right now is huge about how to include gender sensitive data collection. Like, how can we do that? And I have the feeling that we are all calling for it, and there is an raised awareness, but we're still at the point, okay, so how can we do that? And in Germany, we have the same issues as other countries or large data sets, panel data sets as well. They come from a very male perspective, and they're not, with their questions, reflecting a lot of women's reality in life. And yeah, I don't think that is something that we only have in Germany or something, but we're aware of it now, which is, as Alexa said, the first step to take, that we have to have this. Because I remember from an interview where I spoke about like the car sharing thing, that there's a huge gender gap in the use. And some representatives of the car sharing association, they said, oh yeah, we don't see any issues for women to use car sharing. And I was like, yeah, I was actually smiling when I read that, because they were just simply not looking at it. They just ignored it. So if you don't look for it, it's totally easy to ignore that stuff. So yeah, that's something that is changing slowly, but
I like what you said. If you're not looking at it, you won't find it. I think we can all learn. Just if we all walk away with that particular thought in our head, we've made some progress. And there's an interesting point made in the chat, by the way, by someone around the initial analysis of bicycle hire schemes. I think this was one in London, which tended to be mainly used by young male university educated people. And it might have been a success in terms of users and ridership, but not very equally around the whole of the population. Sherin, to you, and closer to home here in the UK for most of us in the call, have you seen examples recently of where data collection has been carried out better in your own work?
Yes, which is good, because picking up some of the examples, such as the government's equality hub, that there has been a bigger emphasis on this during the pandemic. But despite, most often these are on the economy side of things, the impact of the work, the impact of furlough, all of that. So there is a gendered disaggregated collection of data, and examples include the DFT National Travel Survey, especially during the pandemic. TfL, of course, do have really good collections. But one of the things I want to point out is I've been working recently with West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and one of the things they had to do during the pandemic to ensure that they got diverse sets of data was to phone call people. So it might not be quite straightforward. Especially when you start looking at mobile phone data, which is just a big chunk of data that can be easily collected, you might end up looking at a bigger representation of male travel patterns. So I think, picking up on Ines's point, you need to seek those opinions, you need to seek those extra questions to understand why perhaps things are different for different groups, and because that is what the evidence base shows us. And that's where focus groups, understanding of quality data rather than just a big chunk of quantified data that can be just processed and looked at with an equal split, when in fact it might not be an equal split. And just quickly to add on to that, Tom, so one of the key things is, how often are we looking at surveys, let's say passenger surveys, where how convenient is this mode of transport to you, and looking at it by gender, because convenience is key. And when you start having multiple trips, multiple things to do, multiple interchanges to make, convenience becomes a key factor for women a lot more often. And I think when you start looking at these data sets, understanding what is the right thing, perhaps from a public transport point of view or waiting facilities, then it makes a big impact to the type of scheme and objectives that come out from your scheme development.
Yeah, convenience is key. Again, something that, and I think that everybody will benefit from if we get that right. It was not the question I had prepared, but Alexa, I wanted to sort of you as I think a researcher. Are we focusing too much on quantitative analyses and research, and is qualitative research perhaps underplayed in our field?
They have strengths for different purposes. Qualitative research tells you why you're getting the results you are, or not getting the results you expect, and helps just illustrate the richness. When I talk about qualitative, I love both qualitative and quantitative research. And when I'm trying to explain it to my students, I say, if you are not quite sure what questions you should be asking, if you are not quite sure what the experience is that you're trying to understand, start with qualitative research. Because if you don't, if you go straight into a survey, we're all imperfect humans. We write the survey based on what we think we're going to get. And we might be asking things in a way that doesn't resonate with the people we're asking. Even just something as simple as the purpose of a journey, that can be a really simple question, but for some people it's like, well, I'm going to the doctor's and picking up the kids and stopping by the vet. So which of those purposes am I meant to choose? Anyway.
Yeah, a very good point. But I also thought, again, if you're not looking at it or not looking for it, if you don't know what you're looking for, then you will not ask the right questions. And I think that point that you make, that's what qualitative research would help you identify. So maybe we need to take a big step back and say, are we actually just continuing to do the same thing? Because it has been convenient to do so, and we've never actually thought about what are the real questions we should ask.
Well, and I might be gazumping later questions, but we already know so much. We know so much. We don't know everything, but we already know so much about how the travel of women is different and their needs. And we need to sometimes move beyond just trying to understand it more and into the doing. So I'll stop there.
Good pointer. Good pointer. I'm going to move on to data analytics rather than data collection. So, Ines, are our analytical tools also biased?
Yes, sure. Why not? So no, I'm just like it's the same with the qualitative and quantitative part. If you, I mean, you can analyze qualitative data as well, but your question suggests a statistical analysis of the data. So and we know, as I said in my presentation as well, we have this tendency that men are more like keen to do statistical quantitative stuff, and when you have a look at the research that is done where more women are working in, then you see that there is a high tendency for qualitative research as well. And I love combining those two as well, because they have their each their advantages and disadvantages. But with the analysis, when you look at qualitative data analysis, you see that you can have a much more complex situation and analyze that. Whereas when we have just statistical analysis with numbers, I feel like the focus is too much on innovative, cool stuff. Some regressions are advanced modeling, and we're just like changing a tiny bit of the equation, and then we continue. But the whole part is not grasping the complexity of many women and their mobility, not only in the travel patterns. So yeah, the question is, I mean, we have many analytical tools. What's the purpose? How can we come up with our goal for that? And is an analytical tool maybe too much going into one direction that is already set? So like we're looking for something very specific, or are we very open and very explorative when we have a look? And I think that it is important when we look for those differences in people and different behavior and different perception and experiences. We cannot use just like a regression for the whole group. I'm always saying I would love to have some sort of clustering before that, because for each group it is different. And this is something that I miss in the discussion, that you have to have some sort of regression in there and then everything is fine. But if you don't, then it's not cool enough. It's not fancy enough, something like that. So yeah, I think we have a bias in the analytical tool as well.
Yeah, if the aim is getting the best possible fit to your data, then you may not necessarily have the best explanatory model. I think that's the point you make there, isn't it? And we get a bit, as a modeler myself, we get lost in that sometimes. I agree. Sherin, again, sort of around the UK, have you seen anywhere where data analytics, the actual handling of the data, the extracting of the information of the raw data that we collect, that has been done well? Is it about more disaggregation in the analysis to reveal those gender disparities?
So I could perhaps pick up two examples. So one example is around a basic study which Jacobs is doing in the UK, looking at crossings. And it's a very simple study to understand how people prefer different crossings, who prefers why, what's happening behind it. And some of the key, very interesting outputs from that study was, because of the disaggregation of data and because of asking those questions, we come to know that, for instance, people with a disability were more likely to find it difficult to locate the crossing itself. So you have vision impairments, loads of extra add-ons, which perhaps you wouldn't consider because you just go put a crossing there. It's great. It's helping everybody. Another interesting insight was women are more likely to want audible indicators to inform pedestrians when traffic has stopped and when it is very safe to cross, because there is evidence and research which shows that, you know, you're more likely to face harassment from driving vehicles if you're likely to be a woman. So very simple examples of where we can start pulling out key insights to designing these elements of how people just cross a road. So some of the bigger, wider model examples is one of my colleagues, Angela, has taken the development of some tools to look at understanding how benefits are impacting different groups of people. So by segmentation tool using the National Travel Survey, and this is something they've done at TFN, Transport for the North. And that was something where she had to look at the distributional impacts assessment, which is something in the guidance in the UK appraisal methodology, but enhancing it so that we can start using the segmentation of genders to clearly understand which schemes benefit men or women more. And there is a difference in the outputs when you look at that. So for example, when we look at major rail schemes, major road schemes, when you look at trip lengths and the type of trip purposes that we start looking at and who benefits it from most, you get to these conclusions only by doing some sort of a segmentation analysis on these big data sets.
Yeah, the TFN work is actually very interesting. And we can perhaps find a reference to the work that was done there and put it in the chat later. So yeah, segmentation, I'm sure we'll come back to that. You know, just putting more effort into more detail in the way in which not data is collected, but also analyzed, and then feeding into, and I want to move on to that now, sort of the third stage, into the modeling. So I want to talk a little bit about modeling. Obviously, I would like to talk about modeling, but as I've said earlier, that models synthesize the data for the future. So they start from today's observations, and they will create a synthetic future with data that may or may not occur at the time. And I want to do better as well, and ensure that my models reflect everybody's needs, and particularly those of women and other underrepresented groups. Now, my experience is that if you correct for income, for car ownership, for work status, the gender difference isn't actually that great. In our transport models, actually negligible. So I would say, as a white male modeler, we're doing okay, but there is a gender bias, and how can we overcome that? So Sherin, you used to be a transport modeler, I recall. What is the one thing you would change in our transport models that you really think would make a difference?
So just Tom, before I quickly answer your question on the one thing what I'd like to change.
Might be two as well.
I'd like to perhaps, you know, challenge the introduction you provided about correcting for these to find that they are more or less same. Because I truly believe that once you look at income, skill level, employment, type of trip, you're not really going to get it to be exactly the same between the genders, just because there are so many different variables. And I believe transport models would perhaps need to look a bit more ambitious than considering all of them to be of a typical pattern, because we really cannot assume that, you know, for certain groups, the time they travel, how far they go, what mode they use, or perhaps what purpose for their travel would be exactly the same as another group. And I know this is a bit of a challenge, but, you know, I'm happy for the rest of the panel to come in on this later. But I still think that when we start looking at exact income, car availability, skills, the genders could perhaps exhibit similar travel patterns, but there will be differences. And, you know, there is the evidence base to show that there are disparities in the way the use of these transport affects people across the spectrum in different ways. So just to answer your question quickly, one thing that I'd like to change perhaps would be a key review of the values of time and the types of trip purposes which most affect women, and how we incorporate these in our models going forward, because I think these are the two key things that will impact the results from the modeling, and also the impact how we do modeling in the future.
Yeah, I think I certainly pick that up on the trip purpose. I just wondered if and I think this is sort of more a thought rather than a question, whether is this about segmentation, or is this about recognizing that the differences in our segments are actually much greater than we assume, and that just assuming averages across segments is also underplaying the impacts on particularly those groups that are, or those individuals within the groups that are not fitting the norm and therefore are not being well served by assuming and working with averages. Ines, in your experience, is transport decision making as much influenced by models in Germany?
As much as in UK, no. I think the UK is the modeling nation. To me, when I think of UK, then it's just like transport modeling. So yeah, it is not as big in Germany, but of course we still have that. But you might remember we had some issues where the predictions completely failed. Well, there is an airport, there is a train station, and that's just like something where you see it doesn't work. And in computer science, there's this term garbage in, garbage out. You can have great models, but if the data that you are using is not good, then you won't get any good results, any good predictions. And I would like to pick up that, as I'm not a modeler, I'm from the empirical side, and hearing and knowing that if you put gender, income, work status, car availability, all those variables, for instance, in one line, and you put them on the same level, then of course the effect on another variable is not as big for gender because it is already covered in the other variables. Nevertheless, gender affects all these. So I'm always saying I would love to have some sort of multi-level in there in the modeling process as well, like in reality, because gender, age, for instance, mental health, those are variables that are so basic that they come first and affect the other variables that come that are following them. So my question is, when you have an agent-based model, do you consider that you have different groups of people, or do you use averages for all of them? How do you do that?
I guess you're asking me a question here,
Yes.
Ines, as the modeler in the room. Yeah, I mean, a few points on that. I think as a modeler, but also actually picking up on sort of the things that really matter. I think one of the problems that we face in modeling, and it whether it's an excuse or whether this is a really good reason, is that we need to be able to forecast all these variables into the future. So if you take your example, mental health is really important for people's decision making and the way in which they can use the transport system and the choices they make. If we have that as a variable, as a modeler, I would say, then I need to be able to forecast into the future how that variable will be spread across the population in 30 years' time. So it's an easy excuse for me to make. Look, it's much easier to forecast what the income distribution will be than what people's mental state will be. At the same time, I can get a very well fitted model and a model that actually doesn't help at all. So it is an important discussion to have. And picking up on what Sherin said, I think, and I made a note here now, I think the key here is complexity, and we are already often accused, and probably rightly so, that our models are really, really complex. And so to reflect, again, it's an easy thing to say, look, women's travel patterns are even more complex than what we at the moment have in our models. Do we want to make our models more complex to be able to reflect that complexity? And it's a discussion that we need to have. It doesn't necessarily have to be mathematically more complex. It can be, I think our models can be adjusted in those dimensions where we can reflect the complexity that women face. For example, the geographical detail, which often does not deal with the multi-leg trips, the access and egress from public transport. I think it was Sharon, possibly, maybe all three of you mentioned, the security of actually being able to get to a public transport stop. It's about trip-based assumptions that each trip is individual, which again doesn't deal with the linked trips that particularly caregivers need to make. I think there's something about purposes which doesn't need to make our model more complex, but certainly more rich, where escort as a transport, as a purpose for traveling is rarely included in models, and therefore doesn't get any attention in the kind of benefits of disbenefits of schemes. Leisure versus essential shopping is something that also we need to think about a bit more. I think that women and caregivers make many more trips to actually go and go buy essential goods rather than go shopping for leisure or for white goods. So there is quite a lot that we can do, I think, in our models to reflect the realities that that women face without making the models more complex. Agent-based is a way in which to do it, but I don't think that we say, well, if we only had agent-based models and activity-based models, then all these problems would go away. I don't think so. It needs a little bit more thought about what are the real issues that we're trying to solve. So thank you for bringing the modeling aspect into here. I'm also realizing that we're starting to run out of time. So now I want to quickly talk about the fourth aspect, so data collection, analysis, modeling, and evaluation. I think, Sharon, you've already sort of talked about this. And maybe I'll ask you that question again, and maybe you can give us a little bit more detail in your experience on monitoring the outcomes of projects and where you've seen that. You mentioned TFN, maybe you've got another example, or maybe you want to say a bit more about the TFN example.
I'm going to touch on another example just because this is my current research project that I'm doing with TSU at Oxford. So we've picked up a public transport scheme, which, you know, often you think public transport schemes are the one and saving grace to women. But it was interesting to see how that public transport scheme evolved from the beginnings of the scheme development to actually what got onto the ground at the end of the day. And a lot of the components that most impacted women, say for instance like bus stops, access to bus stops, locations where, you know, rather than just your pure priority on the road, ended up not being delivered because they thought, oh, the key thing that we need to get here is improved journey times, so just make the junctions on the road perfectly fine. So when I looked at the monitoring and evaluation report of this project, which has been on the ground for a couple of years, it is interesting at what has been ultimately reported, because the one and the big final data that they've said is we've got 2 minutes of journey time savings for people using the car, as well as 3 minutes of journey time savings for people using the bus. So it is interesting to see who actually then benefits from the scheme, because it was a flagship project, public transport, rapid bus service, great. It's going to benefit everyone because the business case itself said it's going to impact people from lower incomes, etc. But how do you get to the bus stop? What are your accesses to it? How is the fares on it? Because the fares have gone up almost 300% since, you know, the time of the planning of the business case. And finally, for the 2 minutes of journey time savings for the car users, which was seen as an extra benefit, are we really measuring the right benefits? The monitoring elevation report, for instance, did not even look at the gendered impact of people using the bus, because when I used the service myself, I've seen how many people, for instance, women with prams who had to wait just because they couldn't get on the bus on the same route. So I think we'll need to re-evaluate the whole way of collecting data and what types of data we collect. So this is just one example, and you know, we're looking at affordability in this instance, but we can't just assume that, okay, just because a public transport service, which is great, is going to go in, is just idealistically going to have all the exact same expected outcomes. We need to make sure that our objectives of outcomes and outputs clearly translate into something that we want to see that is equitable. So that was an interesting one that I've picked up recently, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. Quickly, Alexa, anything we can learn from Melbourne in terms of evaluation?
Oh, it'd be nice if we did more of it. I think I missed the opportunity earlier on to say, reflect on how modeling is used in decision making in Australia. Usually politicians talk about business cases and BCRs when they talk about what projects they're going to back at the next election, but not always. And it seems the higher level of government that's making these choices, the more opaque the modeling is, if at all. And the benefits are almost exclusively about BCRs and travel time savings. So just red flags everywhere in terms of who that will benefit. And then in terms of evaluating after the fact, by then, we've moved on to another election and another issue to try to grab attention.
Yeah.
Not much to learn from there. We have other things that we do well, but not that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. BCR is a benefit cost ratio. So what are and the benefits are almost exclusively measured in terms of savings of travel time measured as a value of time.
Yeah, and I think it's a good as a fair point, and apologies to all the audience where where all of us as speakers are perhaps falling into our jargon. So the benefits, as Alexa said, and how you measure the benefits and what you consider to be the benefits is actually extremely important in addressing this gender gap.
We had a team here in Australia once that tried to use some empirical data to value an hour of travel time for a low-income person, because traditionally it's based on your income. If you have a higher income, it's believed that you are willing to trade off more money for saving time. But they found that for low-income people, to add a journey to their day, whether that's just by bus, by anywhere, just to be able to be more mobile, had a much higher monetary value for a low-income person. It's how we want to put money against value, and how that ends up washing out in the models and the evaluations in the end.
That's an
Yes.
interesting point, Alex. Tom, if I may just come in with one point.
Absolutely.
I'll be quite interested to see the distributional impacts done on the fare increases to the bus network and the rail network compared to the freeze on fuel duty. I'd be very keen to see if there is a disaggregated distributional impacts done on that. For example, in the UK, I don't know if anyone in the audience does have it, or if we can look at that. It'd be good to see who benefits most.
And and if we can evaluate that rather than just ex ante try and work it out, also evaluate. And if it makes any difference, but anyway, that's a different story. Ines, some final thoughts from you from Germany before we hand over to the audience.
Yes, there is actually. I mean, you have to set the as demonstrated. What's the aim of a project? What are you trying to achieve? If you have a male perspective on what is the wanted outcome, of course, the evaluation is going to go into that direction, because it's just oriented on the aim that you had at the beginning. But there is another tool which is called the gender impact assessment. You can find that online, Google that. It's very, very interesting, because it is especially there to check your project ex ante. And it's supposed to give you some steps to having a look at how does what we just are trying to do, how is this going to affect people with different gender. And this is something that I just would love to see in transport planning, as well as we are planning for almost everyone and not only for a specific group. I mean, actually we are, but we should be planning for more people, very inclusive. And this is something that gives you like a guideline how to do this, and how to have a look at the impact of different people from different genders.
Yeah, and if somebody can be really clever and add the link to the tool in the chat for everyone to benefit from, that'd be great. Thank you to all three speakers, and I certainly enjoyed this very much. But it's not just about the four of us. We've got an audience that has got a lot of questions in the chat now. Juliana has, I think, filtered some of these out for us. I'm not going to go and look at another screen and see if I can pick up one or two of the questions. This is an interesting question that was posed earlier. What changes in transport investment and operation do you think would result from a gender equality approach? What will the things are that will change on the ground if we do our transport planning more in a more gender inclusive way? Sharon, I'm going to give you the least time to think.
I
I'll,
was going
I'll
to ask, sorry,
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead, Ines.
No, I was just asking, did I get the question right? There's someone asking, what do we have if we use gender sensitive planning? What
changes will we see in terms of the investments that are being made and the way in which the transport system will be operating?
Okay. So yeah, Francis, go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a start on this, Tom. So I think that there is a lot of evidence to back this up. So for instance, we look at a lot of the countries in Europe, so Sweden, the Netherlands, Copenhagen, especially let's pick up just cycling, for instance. You're going to see a lot of increase in number of cyclists. For example, there is a recent study where they looked at Paris and Lisbon, and they found that the number of female cyclists increased a lot when you started putting in investment in the bike lanes, the type of measures, the type of safer segregated routes. So there is evidence that you're going to have technically a lot more people taking part in traveling, in mobility. They're able to move. And then, of course, I'm not going to go into the wider outcomes, but some of the bigger outcomes include you might have a better social care impact because you have a lot more people walking, moving, cycling. So you're going to have a less burden on the medical, on the social care systems. And then you're going to enhance participation. Like I think Alex or someone was saying before that, you know, once you start looking at the nighttime economy, when the fact that you can start encouraging people to access this, you're going to get a productivity economic boom. So I think a lot of people misinterpret the advantages as, oh, it's just fine, people are going to walk more, cycle more, and just, you know, get about their lives. But we should realize that it has a wider economic impact. So you're looking at a wider, bigger, productive society as well as a lot more healthier society. So I think it's a win-win situation for everyone, which is, you know, often has to be reiterated.
Yeah, no, absolutely, couldn't agree more. Ines, have you got something to add to that? What will we see as a change?
We will see that more projects will focus on neighborhoods and not commuting, because commuting is always the focus. It's so important because the economy and so on. But the things behind that women tend to do more often, like taking care of the household, of the children. So men typically can go to work. That is not seen. So that is not benefited, and therefore not financially evaluated by putting projects out there that change, for instance, sidewalks, make a safer cycling infrastructure there just for the short neighborhood trips. And like there are those cycling highways. Who benefits from that? People with commuting needs. And that is, as we've seen, as we know, that more men benefit from that. So yeah, we will see those changes.
I'll just add that you would have cities where everyone feels safe traveling alone at night. That you get the connections right, you get the lighting right, you get the societal. It's more than just the transport system to feel safe traveling at night, but that's one of the improvements I think you would see if there was a much different emphasis. But I agree with what the other two speakers said as well. Yep. Also, access to more toilets. It's not a joke. If you're a carer of children or older people or with a disability, to get accessible access to clean, safe toilets is not a non-issue. It is an important part of traveling independently that I think is very much overlooked by able-bodied people.
I must say, Alexa, if from your experience in Australia that's bad, you should come and travel in the UK, because I was amazed by the availability of clean toilets in most of Australia. So it's one thing that Australia does better than the UK. Maybe not good enough yet. I've got a very interesting question that has a lot of likes here. I'm going to read it out verbatim. I'm curious to understand how information or views are captured on what female preferences are, i.e. not represented in data, as opposed to the data collection about the current state. So what do women really want rather than what do women currently do? And maybe that's true, actually, not just for women, that's across the whole of the population. Any thoughts on that? Sorry, Alex, I'm going to go back to you because you are our behavior expert. Maybe I'm doing you an injustice here, Ines, but let me start with with Alexa first. So how do we if we just keep capturing information about what people do now, we don't learn very much about what they really would like to do if they were given the opportunity. How do we do that?
But that's why you need lots of different methodologies for research, not just modeling existing behavior into the future, but the qualitative research, the survey research to actually talk to the people and find out what they want. I love, sorry, as well, seating and walking routes in neighborhoods, baby changing facilities. If you don't ask, if you don't have a baby at home, you know, you're not going to think about that these are the things that are barriers. And we, like I said, we actually know a lot of this stuff already. I think and I think it's more about paying attention to it and codifying it and putting it into guidance and acting on it.
Ines, I'm going to go back to the work that you described earlier in this context around. I think this was why men used shared mobility much more. So on that basis, you know, you might make certain decisions. Maybe you don't have to provide for women because obviously women want to use it, whereas actually women might want to use it very much, but are not using it for other reasons. Did you manage to explore that a bit more and sort of come up with really valuable advice on how maybe the design needed to change?
Yes. I actually came up with, I think, 31 specific measures derived from those obstacles. And I even had a small project with a car sharing operator to have a look at them, but they're very, very careful with the implementation of those things because they are still at the point thinking, oh, would that be beneficial for us? We have to have first the information that we will make money out of improving our services to make them more gender sensitive and gender inclusive. And this is something where I think, yeah, if they want to be part of like an actual even public transport solution, if they want to be seen, then they shouldn't be a toy for a specific group of academic white men at a certain age with a certain interest in technology and innovation. So this is something. So yes, I came up with actual measures, and I'm happy to share them. If anyone is interested, just get in contact.
Great. Sherin, any further thoughts on this before whilst I find the next question to ask?
I'll just add one final thing is around how usually passenger satisfaction surveys are done on public transport and rails. I always find them a bit interesting because they ask you things that perhaps could be enhanced about what would make it convenient. Do you feel safer enough? So I think changing the way we ask these satisfaction questions, because your satisfaction should be not just about, you know, if you had reached your destination 5 minutes within the destination time, but it should be enhanced as to what could have been made convenient. Do you think having this interchange facility here would have made your life easier? So I still think there is a way we can change these kinds of surveys. We should capitalize more on those to make it a lot more inclusive.
Thank you.
Could I have a note just because I think Ines raised a really important question about future technologies and emerging technologies and the implications there for gender, because most of these technologies are first thought of by men generally, often men of very high educational standing who have problems in their life that they know the way to solve with this new technology, and it probably would solve their problem very well. But when you ramp it up to a societal level, the people who benefit from that potential new technology are probably the people most like the people who imagine them in the first place because they work very well for their needs. But do they work for the needs of other members of society? I think is something we really need to interrogate carefully.
Yeah, that is called I methodology. That has a name, that you just come up with a solution that benefits your perspective and your needs, and exactly. So yeah.
I've also heard it called elite projection. For elites, thinking of how Jarrett Walker, I think it is. Make sure.
New terms. Ines, you've started something here because people have asked for the 31 measures now in the chat. So yeah. See if you can dig them out. You don't have to do that now. Slightly off topic, but I think relevant is a question that came through, which is: we are already aware of data bias relevant to gender and race. Are there any other biases that we ought to look out for? Ines, you nod your head.
Yes, I mean, diversity has so many levels. When you have a look at the research that is done on unconscious bias, there you see a lot of different aspects that can affect your perception of the person. And so like age, health, gender, even the income, the clothes you're wearing, all that can have a huge impact and lead to discrimination. And of course, we have to look at intersections of those categories in diversity, because there are some which combine different variables of discrimination, and yeah, they actually suffer a lot. They are not seen a lot. So we have to have a look at specifically those groups as well. And very, very important, not see them as some sort of vulnerable person, although they are discriminated. Because I had requests to talk about vulnerable users, and then I was supposed to speak about women, and I was like, I don't consider myself as a vulnerable user compared to men, just because this is the standard, and I don't look like the standard, I don't behave like the standard. So this is something that I would like to see, that we get away from that male standard and see everything else as an exception that we might or might not consider. So we should see that we are all completely colorful and different, and acknowledge this in the data and in the models.
Alexa, you said you've done quite a bit of work in the States as well, where I think this is done much more and much better. Are there things we can learn there?
Oh, look, in the United States, they take a perspective of environmental justice, where it's actually legislated that the impacts of a transport project must not have a disproportionately negative impact on it's generally communities of African-American communities or Latino communities, et cetera, because of historical inequities of bulldozing historic Black neighborhoods and building freeways, right? So that's the lens that they take. It's a more legalistic, antagonistic approach, which I don't think is necessarily the most productive way forward. I'm really excited, Ines, to hear what's going on in Germany, and I want to catch up with you afterwards and learn more.
I like that point, by the way, that you make there, Alex. Do we do this because we have to, or do we do this because we want to? And I'd like to think that we are trying to get, Sharon, do you agree with me that we're trying to get a position because we want to here in the UK now?
Yeah, it's interesting because picking up on Alex's point, we have the Equality Act in the UK, which is, since 2010 and advocates for a similar thing. But I think it's important to not think about for them and for us, or because this is what is the most economically viable option. So I think it is important more than ever to set objectives and context of why transport schemes are being built and for whom right at the beginning of the project, because that's what I find a bit unsure about the current appraisal methodology in the UK. Is you develop your transport scheme objectives, you look at problems, issues, you develop an option, and then you start looking at distributional impacts and impacts on everyone else. So it is a bit late in the stage, because then you're just retrofitting your scheme to meet what is required as per the guidance. So I think there needs to be a bit of a change in the way the guidance sets out these elements of this. These are the things you're doing and why you're doing it to show X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up question here, which is about what about sexual orientation? Apart from identifying safe areas and well-lit areas, very little is actually being done on including or representing sexual orientation in our equality impact assessment. Is it done better elsewhere? General, any of the three speakers?
I would like to say that's actually a very, very small area of research currently, which is really sad because we have had incidents where queer people were attacked in public transport just because they were showing visible signs. And this is something that when we ask about gender or how you identify, a lot of people, first of all, the older people, they are like, oh, I'm a man, I'm a woman. So for them, it's just not a question. But others, the younger generation, they're starting to question that. And we have to take that gender variable away from the sexual orientation. Because it used to be that you were defined by your sexual orientation. So you are into men as a man, so you are gay. So that is how you're supposed to be. Or you are into women as a woman, then you are a lesbian. So this is something where we have to separate the spheres of gender, of sex, into like what can others see of me in public transport? How do I behave? And how do I identify myself, and what am I interested in? So there are different dimensions when it comes to gender. And this is something where we need to do a lot more research. And I'm looking forward to anyone picking up on that. Or if you have some studies, get in contact. I'm really, really keen for them.
Yeah, anyone that's can add something to the chat on where relevant work has been done on this. Much appreciated. Don't know, Sharon or Alexa, if you can add to that.
I can point people to the Monash University Art and Design School has a group called the XYX Lab that does intersection of transport and design. And a lot of it is about gender sensitive design, but they also look at LGBTQI plus and design and implications there. They even have a fact sheet about collecting gender sensitive data generally around incidents, because incidents of harassment, etc., are massively underreported. So how do you get better data in that space? So that's another one I'll just put in the chat. It's the XYX Lab, Monash University, if people want to look into that some more.
Thank you. I think it's as Ines said as well, grossly under researched. I'm picking up a few more questions here.
Tom, I think you're being ushered to close on the WhatsApp.
Am I?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so you're looking actually at the third screen, are you? We close at 13:15. Oh, I thought sorry people, I thought we closed at 13:30. I'm very sorry about this. My fault. So I'm going to do my closing comments then now. So first of all, apologies. Second of all, thank you all for attending and for all the questions that were asked. I didn't get round to answering or to asking these questions of our panel. There were quite a lot of them. Of course, thank you, Ines, Alexa, and Sherin. I really was pleased that we had an international panel here today. One of the advantages, of being able to do this as a webinar. I need to thank Juliana O'Rourke from Landor. She organized today and the whole of the Gender on the Agenda sessions. And as so often, the people that work the hardest are the least visible. So thanks, Juliana. And by the way, Juliana also helps and also directs the Modeling World Conference, where obviously many of you will want to sort of attend as well. My favorite day of the year, as I often say. So a final thought before we break up. There were about 400 people that signed up for this. There were about 150 people that attended. I did a quick assessment. About the attendance was about 75% female and 25% male. the actual split in transport planning is probably roughly 66% or 2/3 male and 1/3 female in our field. So we are missing a lot of men in these discussions. So I would say encourage your male colleagues to join in and to listen in and to participate in these discussions. There are, I hope, a further gender on the agenda event still to be had. So I'm going to close this late. Apologies, and I really hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.